We're going to just have Is it Professor here? Yeah, it is.
Sit down and here. Thank you. We're trying to bring you along. So, good morning, everyone. If you're sitting in the back, if you could come up and kind of populate these seats, that would be really helpful because we do have one panelist who has laryngitis and we don't have mics. So the closer you are, the more likely you are going to be able to hear everybody. Good morning, welcome. For those of you who I don't know, there's a lot of fresh faces, so that's wonderful. I'm Erin Sharon, I'm on the board of AIGA New York. I'm also, for those of you who came to Design Incubation, Director of Fellowships at Design Incubation, and I teach graphic design at St. John's University. So thank you all for being here. I know it is probably the nicest Saturday of 2018, so it's not a small thing for all of you to have come out and devoted your Saturday morning to us. Just to do some housekeeping, this is a two-part event, right? So in the morning we have the panel, in the afternoon we have a workshop. In order to keep costs low, we are not providing brown bag lunches. The city is your brown bag lunch. So please go out, grab something to eat. You can even bring a sandwich back if you want. Get a little sun, but not so much that you forget to come back. For those of you who are just staying with us this morning, that's great as well. There is the restrooms for those of you who have not made it that way are around sort of the cafe part. So if you just sort of follow your way around there and take a left on that side or right on that side, you'll find restrooms. We'd like to thank General Assembly. That's whose space we're in here. As you can see, this is a fantastic space. My students and I have decided we're moving in. We're already divvying up the different areas, but it's really amazing because with AIGA New York, part of the way we're able to keep costs low is that we ask for space to be donated. So partners like General Assembly donating space really do go a long way to be helping us be able to do that. Trying to think if there's any other housekeeping things. No, I think that's it. So for our panel today, which is what we're doing this morning, we have 4 very different panelists, and how their own work intersects with accessible design and design for disability is different enough that we hope to have a lively discussion this morning. We're going to start the first part of the discussion working off of some pre-prepared questions, and then the goal is really to engage with all of you, the audience. So as these folks are talking, if you have questions, if you have things that you think that we should be talking about or asking that have not been, please make note of that because the second half of the discussion is really going to be engaging with all of you. We want this to be an open back and forth. In addition to General Assembly, I also, like my last shout out is to my student Stephen Verdilli, who's here today, who helped me as I was looking to prepare today, so a big thanks to him as well. So we're going to start I'm going to start by asking the panelists to introduce themselves. That's going to give you a bit of context so that you understand where they're coming from when they're answering the questions. And I'm going to get on this very high stool here and hopefully not fall off. I'm going to begin by asking you to each introduce yourself and tell us how your own work intersects with inclusive design and or design for disability. Do you want to go first, Bo, since you're sitting next to me? You're in the hot seat.
Yeah, sure. Hi. I'm Bo Campbell. I work for IBM. I'm a designer. I'm an interaction designer by trade. I have a master's in HCI. And I work in the accessibility leadership team at IBM, which is inside of our research organization. And basically, what I do on a day-to-day basis is enable designers across IBM to do accessible design. And I think probably the unique experience that I bring to this is the amazing scale that IBM has of design teams and product teams, right? So we have hired in the last 5 years over 1,000 designers into IBM, and they're all disseminated onto different product teams, and there are thousands of products, right? So what I see, and if you have any questions from these areas, the things that I see are really a lot of different teams doing a lot of different things with accessibility. Everything inside the IBM has to be accessible. So we're on a constant basis, we're enabling teams to kind of do that.
Great, and I just point out, especially for those of you who are students in the audience, that we're going to use the term product to talk about both digital and physical products, for those of you who aren't familiar with that. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Neil Ward. I'm a graphic designer by trade, and I teach graphic design at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. So it was a very wonderful invitation to come to New York City to get out of flyover country. So I teach at Drake University, and I kind of got into inclusive design, universal design, because I saw some needs on campus and in the Des Moines community that I brought into my classroom because I thought it was important for my students to engage in this process and think about needs from people who might have different abilities than themselves. So that's how I kind of got into this, through a wayfinding signage project for a campus building and a product for a disabled veteran too. So that's kind of that's how I got into it.
My name is Liz Jackson. Little background, because it's hard for me to sort of explain where I'm at without giving the background. So I woke up 6 years and 14 days ago to a weird neuromuscular condition. And when I ended up getting out of the hospital, I needed eyeglasses and a cane. And for me, the question was, why are my eyeglasses fashionable when my cane is not? And so I didn't have a formal design education. I really cobbled together a design education, and where I'm at now is my question really is about where in the accessibility and inclusion space is there room for actual disabled people, disabled expertise, and disability identity, and how can I really bring disabled people into the picture? So, you know, I think about it in terms of design, but I also think about it in terms of what I see as sort of the ingenious creativity that disabled people cultivate because we have to navigate a world that isn't built for our bodies. And so how can we apply that to design?
And I'm Elizabeth Guppy. I teach up at SUNY Purchase, and my area of expertise is design history, theory, criticism, and I've written a couple of books in that area. But I think the whole question of design and disability has been haunting me for a long time, and without me acknowledging it, because I identify as a disabled person with cerebral palsy. So in my teaching career at Purchase, I'd have to say that over the years it became more and more obvious to me how disabled I was, because I was teaching at a campus that was ideally designed for disabled people. It was actually a real showcase in the 1960s. But gradually, I started to see that a lot of the accommodations there started to be taken away with no kind of interest or knowledge of it. So that started to make me annoyed at first. I was just really angry. And I started to do some research into this and discovered that really a lot of people have not thought about what design and disability really is. It really startled me, in fact. So I wrote a book called Designing Disability, which came out a couple of months ago. It really is, though, a history of the disability symbol icon, which I'd be happy to talk about at great length later. But I have to tell you guys that I'm here for something else, which is deeply personal, which is I have really lived through this experience of what it is to be a person whose body does not match the world around it. And in fact, I'm in a situation where actually things have been getting worse and worse. So for me, it's really important. I finally decided to own this as an issue. The deeper I got into it, I discovered it wasn't just the problem of my campus, but there are these whole areas of design where people haven't had a really good discussion of what disability is and how it impacts design. And indeed, especially in digital environments. So for me, it's not, digital environments are navigable because my cerebral palsy does not interfere in that sort of way in my mismatch. But I can see a lot of other people having problems. So that's my point of entry as well.
Great, thanks so much. So I think particularly for those of us who are not steeped in this field already, it would be useful to just sort of think about the term inclusivity and what that actually means, and see if there's any variation in how all of you are thinking about it. It's sort of become a buzzword. But I'm wondering if you can just sort of address what is inclusive design, and then as sort of an addendum addendum to that, like, is it a process or is it the product that comes out of it? And I would say, maybe, if you don't mind, Liz, we'll start with you. And I would also invite you, if you want to sort of contrast that with your thinking about the word disability, and how you use the two of them together. But
Yeah, so I think
invite you to do that.
I think this is going to be one of the ways that I wildly vary from the rest of the panel, which is that in a lot of ways I sort of reject this terminology and idea around inclusion, and it's for some reasons that I think are becoming increasingly pervasive in the disability community, namely that when we talk about inclusion and diversity, it tends to sort of forget that we exist. But the interesting thing is, in this you can sort of look at in other aspects of disability, which is, I'm a big proponent of this idea of say the word disability. It is a construct in the same way that blackness and womanhood and all these other things are a construct. And so when people come in and they use terms such as differently abled or special needs, what it does is it increases the stigma of the word disability, and it makes it harder for disabled people to identify as such. And so I see that there's this, there's this same sort of euphemistic notion in terms of design thinking about the terms that we use around disability design. There's adaptive and there's accessible and there's inclusive and there's all these different things, but really what I sort of see is that they're really just avoiding the word, which is disability. And so I prefer the phrase disability design.
Great, yep. I was wondering, I was thinking, Bo, you might have just, from the perspective of being a large organization and where the term accessible design comes in there, do you have sort of a different view of, or a different perspective from the context of the organization you work in?
Yeah, a little bit. I actually love that answer. So we do accessibility, at least when I came into this group about 4 years ago. And I was brought into the group to communicate with designers from a group that was doing sort of rule-based accessibility work, trying to be the cops on campus that were forcing people to do this. And we were clashing with designers. I was actually in the design group at the time, there was a clash between the two. When I moved into accessibility, there really wasn't another word for accessible design. And inclusive design has come along, universal design has been around a long time. When I first heard inclusive design, I actually didn't like the term inclusive design, because to me it means that in somewhere it's excluding some people. It sounds, the sound of it, I like universal a little bit better. I don't like labeling it as much, and I like the idea of using disability. We use the term people with disabilities all the time when we talk about designing and including people with disabilities in our design work, including them in the use of research, including them in the design exercises. And I've been looking into a lot of the qualitative growth that designers might have from those experiences too. I think, honestly, it's a very tough question for me personally to answer, because as Liz was answering, I realized that my definition or my idea of the term inclusive design is kind of floating right now. Like that actually changed my opinion of it a little bit, and so I think that's my experience of that term coming into use is probably my best explanation that I can give.
So yeah, I'd like to pick up on that. So one of the reasons why we're here is that, from what I've noticed, is that there is a really strong and vocal disability rights community that's out there, and then there's a design community, and I'm not seeing a lot of kind of conversation going on between the two, where we get things like these terms that are buzzing around, and it feels sometimes when I move between the two groups that they're not intersecting. So it's interesting to me to hear what were actually two different points of view kind of coming out, and I'm more than happy to go further and talk about that. But I'm just going to weigh in as somebody who's trying to put this together in my own mind. So when I hear the word inclusive design, what I'm hearing is not the old universal design shtick, which was that we're designing for disabled people. So Liz, that's how I've understood it. Yeah. So we talk about this heritage we have for the last 30 years or so of what's called universal design. So that would be things like the curb cuts that you see in sidewalks and other attempts to make the physical environment adapted so universally it's available for everybody. But that's changed, because that's not been a full success, just to be really clear. And so there's been this newer wave, and my understanding of inclusive design was that it was something, a term that's supposed to be including especially people who have disabilities, making them part of the design process. So my understanding was that it was supposed to be including disabled people into design itself. But what I'm hearing from you is maybe that's not then actually happening, or?
Well, so for me, one of the things I discovered was if you go on Google and you Google the phrase design for disability, you'll see that it yields more than twice as many search results as disability design. This idea that we're recipients of design rather than drivers is so predominant, it's embedded itself in our language. But I see how disability ingenuity, when we're given a chance to design for ourselves, how it's changed the world. I often tell the story of, does anybody here use Fingerworks? So in 1998, there was this guy, his name is Wayne Westerman, and he had some carpal tunnel and some tendonitis. And he decided that he was going to create a technology that would allow him to continue working, and so he created Fingerworks. And then in 2005, Steve Jobs bought it. It's the iPhone touchscreen. So I actually, and I can keep going or I can just stop.
No.
So do you guys know the story of OXO? So OXO kitchen products, they're good grips. They're these beautiful, sort of dense kitchen products. And so if you go on their website, you'll read the story behind OXO, which is that Sam Farber created OXO after he saw his wife having a hard time peeling a carrot. So he wanted to make a kitchen peeler that was easier for her to use. So I work with a couple of people who were on the original OXO team. One is this guy named Tucker. And this one day, I said, Tucker, will you tell me about Sam's wife, Betsy? And he was like, oh yeah. He's like, do you know she was a designer? And I was like, no, I did not know she was a designer. So I reached out to Betsy and I said, Betsy, did Sam really design these for you? And she said, no. She said, I'm going to go down in history as being Sam's lowly crippled wife instead of being the person that had the idea for OXO. It was her idea. And so what happens is disabled people come up with these ingenious solutions, but we're never credited. And so what happens is, in sort of these inclusive and universal designs is industry picks up on it and uses it for another application, and we're sort of written out of the process and sort of written as recipients rather than drivers of design. And so for me, it's really about getting disabled people to take, if I sell something as inclusive, which I don't see it as disabled, it would be about getting disabled people to take credit for their ingenuity, their creativity, and their solutions, and to see their ingenuity and their solutions as creative. Because time and time again, we're not given credit.
Thanks.
Sorry.
I know. We've already talked a little bit.
Neil, I was just wondering, with these terms and your experiences sort of working with students, like how are you explaining these terms and how they fit in today's world to students who may be learning about these terms for the first time and may not have their own personal experience with disability?
So I feel that universal design and inclusive design, they have the same principles, but I think inclusive design is a lot more specific. And in the classroom, I kind of bring them through the process of creating empathy for the user and identifying a user need. And I don't mean just a need that we pluck out of thin air, I mean a need that actually needs to be solved. Because one other issue in this field is that people create items for a need that's not really a need.
Yes.
That's our whole world, right?
Yes, exactly. So throughout the process, so for the product for the disabled veteran, who is a personal friend of mine, he had a stroke about 5 years ago, and the right side of his body he doesn't have any use of it. He can kind of lift his arm a little bit, and he has an electronic box on his knee that helps send electrical pulses that make his leg move. But throughout that process, we had a user flow, so kind of what user flow of making eggs in the morning. So if you ever have tried to make eggs for yourself with one arm in the kitchen, it's extremely difficult, especially cracking eggs, extremely difficult. But part of the process was to create empathy. So the students had to disable their dominant arm and then go through the day with their non-dominant arm and then kind of write down, what were the challenges, what were your needs, and then based on that, then they started iterating a product. But they also met with the disabled veteran too to reflect on their 24 hours of empathy exercise versus what the veteran's 24 hours or the rest of his life kind of looks like. So we walk through that to get that empathy, because I feel in these projects, especially in the classroom, if there's not that empathy, there's not that human understanding or human connection, the students they're not buying into the project. So as we talk about this, we're specifying a very specific need, we're specifying a very specific individual, but from that, we kind of end at a universal design at the end. So for instance, one of the products were bowl weights, and does everybody know what peeps are? Little mushroom thing, yeah. So they looked like peeps, and they actually hooked over the rim of a bowl, and they were really brightly colored. The prototype was made from really bright Play-Doh. So when we got done with the project, these bowl weights, which came in a set of 3, they satisfied the need of stabilizing a bowl. So if you're eating ice cream with one arm, that's going to keep the bowl from shifting around on the table. But when we talk about the larger idea here, that's really a universal design that can be used for infants, that can be used for anybody really, for pets, to keep their bowls solid on the ground. So it's more process, product, and then really bringing them through, really bringing them through the process. So when they do wind up working at IBM, or anywhere else, they have this process, they have this skill set to then bring to whatever project they're working on.
Elizabeth, as our resident historian here, do you want to just catch us up for those people who aren't familiar with universal design and like what that term originally was? It just really quickly. I'm just thinking particularly some of the students in the audience.
Yeah, so, and in fact, I just heard the term being used, and you were sussing it out in a way that I had not made really explicit when I said a moment ago. So there is this thing called universal design, which is generally within industry the standard, and within the government. It's the standard of how we understand that we're supposed to be accommodating disabled people. And it is a term that came out in the 1980s, and it was innovated by Ron Mace, who was an architect who became also an activist because he was a wheelchair user. And his argument was that what you do is you design, of course, for the margins, the people who are most in need of special sorts of accommodations, but you end up helping everybody universally. So think of something like the curb cut. That's usually shown as being, those dips in our sidewalks in intersections. That's usually one of the gold standards of universal design, and that accommodates not just people who are wheelchair users, but also people who have strollers, people who are skateboarders, a whole kind of variety of other people. So the idea is that there is this kind of universal accommodation that's going on. Now, I'm actually chairing a session in a couple of months over in Europe called "Is Universal Design Dead?" And in a lot of ways, I would argue that that was a very kind of time-centered, specific kind of approach, but it seems to be kind of being left behind, partly because it's partly a failure. I don't mind going on a little bit further to that extent, or maybe to bring this up as just a kind of question for the audience, or maybe also a question for you guys. So first of all, I want to say that as we've been talking, I don't know if anybody's noticed it, but every example we've been giving so far is in the physical world. But the problem that we're actually here for today is to talk about digital environments. And I suspect the reason why we're not articulating it is, even though we're all trying to figure this out, we are just trying to figure this out. What is access in a digital environment? Because it is so overlooked. And I just want to also make one other point, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act was written and passed in 1990, and it's been updated since then, but it does not encompass digital environments really in any way. That situation has not been helped in the last 6 years. The Obama administration started to insist that their Department of Justice start bringing out specific guidelines for designers to follow. But I want to just make clear that the government's not going to step in and do this for us, because those guidelines came up in July to be brought into action, and the current Justice Department put it on what they call now the inactive list. So that is, with this new presidential administration, it's actually a step back from trying to bring in what is a very chaotic situation some kind of order to it. So I just want to make clear that also, as we're sitting here today, I feel a sense of kind of urgency because this is not going to take place from anybody other than designers themselves to start to figure this out. We're kind of stuck now having to deal with this on our own.
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings up a great point. I think you and I have had this conversation, Bo, like if, you know, the carrot or the stick, and I think there was a sense that some regulation might move some areas of industry forward around digital accessibility, and then there's been sort of a shrinkage in that area. And so I said, like, what about a company like IBM that's thousands of employees, tens of thousands of employees, right? Or maybe even hundreds of thousands of employees, you know, who has made a real commitment ahead of those regulations. And I had asked you, you know, what happens now? So do you want to sort of share some of those ideas?
Yeah, so you're taking my curb cut slides right out of my workshop.
Oh, sorry.
But I included that it helps tarantulas, so I
I haven't done that one.
yeah, so I have so many thoughts swirling around this conversation because we're coming all the way from universal, which that was a little different definition, but design for everybody. Let's just say that instead of universal design. All the way to what I'm kind of been reading about lately, which is also Ablest Design, which is designed specifically for people with disabilities only, right? So there's this huge spectrum in between, and then I hear Liz talking about the fact that we don't want to eliminate the term disabled, and so I don't know what the answer is, where that falls in between, because for me, my mindset, and sorry, I'll get back to the digital question, because I just wanted to express this really quickly. I've thought of design for people with disabilities as good design for everybody. That's just kind of the way that, you know, most of the digital design that we teach designers is good design anyway. The only thing in digital design that I would say is kind of ableist, and I actually wrote a paragraph on the start of a blog post last night on this, is WIARIA code for screen readers. So WIARIA code is little labels that you put inside of HTML that get served out to screen readers for people that use screen readers that have vision disabilities. And it's the only use of that code is for screen readers and people with disabilities. And I feel like it's very archaic, and I think it's ableist in its design. So everything else, almost I would say everything else that we do for digital design as far as accessibility goes helps some other demographic. Not to mention that the seniors, and as we all get older, we all become disabled, and especially our vision and our hearing, and this all is very pertinent for digital design, right? We're all gonna have these issues. And for those of you in the room who are over 40, and there aren't a ton of us in here, but when you have to use your phone to look at a menu in a restaurant and things like that, right? We start to see that this type of design is really, it really helps everyone. So I think it's really interesting, this idea of design for everybody and where that falls with, you know, and being a person, my oldest son has a disability. He has a syndrome called charge syndrome. It's very rare. So I do live with someone with a disability. I don't, besides my aging disabilities, I don't personally have that experience. So it's very interesting to hear that point of view in this specific subject for me, where to come at that from. You know, I've learned a lot.
Can I just ask you to drill down and give us a little bit of examples of the kind of digital product you're working with at IBM so that it becomes a little more concrete? Yeah. So we just might not know what digital product you guys are making these days.
Sure. So the areas that are most interested in accessibility, so we have what we call corporate instruction 162, CI 162. And that mandates that all of our digital products, basically all of our web applications, all of our websites are accessible when they're released. Okay? There are too many ways around that at the current time. You can, you know, fill out a petition it's called deviation, and not have to do it. But the areas where accessibility is necessary for the market is really in the government systems. So enterprise software for governments, right? Healthcare systems. Everybody that's in the Capitol that works on a computer system that IBM develops for them, an enterprise system that holds their data, that, whatever it might be, however archaic it might be on, Windows 7 or whatever, or earlier. All of that has to be accessible in order to sell to those markets. Healthcare is a big one. If you look in the news, banks are being sued right now for not being accessible. So banks are a big one that come to us, right? So most of the designers that come to me without me being proactive are working on web applications for these industries. So whether you're logging into Wells Fargo, those interfaces and all the data behind that, all the programming that IBM would do, those are the types of products that I'm mostly working with. So it's a lot of really web application stuff. There's some mobile application development that's a little easier. So digital design that's native to the operating systems has a lot more accessibility built into it, as Apple is building that in. So if you build a native application, you have less work to do. But the web area is kind of still sort of, I don't want to say Wild West, but I do kind of want to say archaic. As we work with the web browser companies directly, we're on the standards committees, and so are they, and we work with them as they release their new releases of the browsers and what they're going to understand from the code to deliver to people with disabilities, right? So we're constantly pushing them. And Windows will release a new browser that just totally forgot about accessibility, and so then as a person or as a company that needs to sell accessible products, we have to push them to make sure that our products can be used on their products too, right? So that's kind of another side.
And Elizabeth, you were saying that there's some pretty, for those of us particularly in education, there's some pretty easy things to do baseline in terms of digital accessibility.
Right. I think actually in the classroom, a lot of what constitutes what's we're told to do as a student of good design often takes care of those problems, but they're not flagged in the classroom. This is why you're doing this. This is
So
why.
can you give some examples
Well,
of those programs?
I'm going to actually, not being a teacher in that area, I think I'd rather turn to Neil or Bo about that, because you guys know more or less the basics of what that is. But go, I think
what would digital problems be?
Oh, like specific
Yeah, like
issues that we
specifically,
would address?
like what would be the issues you would address in a enterprise-based software that goes?
Yeah. So I guess starting at the lowest hanging fruit would be color contrast issues, or for instance, let's take white text on yellow background, right? Which
If you went to design school.
if you work in
Yeah.
this industry, you'll see it everywhere, and I'm not kidding. And I just saw it on a TV commercial last night. It's the weirdest thing. I mean, really. That's an easy one. Consider people who are colorblind. And let's say that you use a red button to say stop and a green button to say go, but you don't label them, and right, that would be something that would be impossible for someone to use. If a user is blind, they obviously are not going to be able to read the screen. You need some way to give that person the same experience, right, or try to give them the same type of experience in that way. Yeah, I think that's.
Just to pick up on that.
Yeah.
So what you're saying exactly, this is stuff that I think any person who's been trained as a designer kind of knows already. But I think it's really important to be aware that these are the reasons why this is. It's kind of like having those blue and white symbols all around the world around us, labeling accommodations, because the symbols there are for disabled people to know where the accommodations are, but they also do something else. Those signs everywhere keep reminding able-bodied people as well, non-disabled people, that these accommodations are there. So for people who maybe will need a little bit more help or are using these spaces differently. And I think in the classroom, if you're going to say using white, don't put yellow on white, then it would be good to bring out the reason why that's not just bad design for everybody, but it really has deep consequences for somebody who's colorblind, for example. So my concern is, I do believe we should be really, really clear. We should know better about the reasons why we teach even the most basic things, because it helps designers to have this in their mind and to start seeing other areas that they can make these accommodations.
So I love that because I didn't do my master's too long ago, actually, and I loved it. I could have just gone to school forever and learned about cognitive psychology. I just loved it. So what happened was I had a career in design and web development that came before that. And then I thought I kind of knew what I was talking about. And then I went to school and I learned the heuristics behind I learned the reasons behind the heuristics that I had been using, which I hadn't gone to that level before. And I think that should have gone further, and I don't think that's gone far enough, because it's the next step is to include the outliers in the cognitive lessons that we learn for the heuristics. And I did not learn about that. I wasn't taught. I was taught, the average user can remember 7 things, blah, blah, blah. But then we're generalizing, and we're not including, I didn't learn anything about people with disabilities at that time. So I think that was the gap, and that's where I've been filling into. So, yeah.
So talking about pushing industry forward, Liz, do you want to talk a little bit about your work with advocacy and trying to get behind making change that way?
Yeah, so sort of in the conversation that I've sort of been hearing over the last few minutes, the thing that I haven't heard is a sort of a single disabled person being treated as an expert in this process. And if you sort of look through the history of compliance, what you see is you see a process of radical disabled people pushing for change, legislation happening, and then that legislation writing disabled people out of the process. And so what happens is instead of us being treated as experts and brought in to consult in these areas, instead what happens is there's these very specific standards that really oftentimes have very little logic or reason. So I remember in 2017 there was this really fascinating thing that happened. I sort of call it the summer of 2 adapts. So on the one hand, you have my peers at National Adapt, and they were, I believe they saved healthcare. They were on Capitol Hill every day in their wheelchairs with their canes, fighting with signs and asking for change. And a lot of their signs would say something like "nothing about us without us," or "our existence is resistance," like these very empowered phrases. And at the same time, on the other side, you had these 3 companies that decided that they were going to have an adaptive clothing line. You had Tommy Hilfiger, you had Zappos, and you had Target. And not a single one of the companies consulted or spoke with a single disabled person in the entire process. And so what happened at the end result is that one of the companies decided they were going to put out an adaptive t-shirt that said a phrase on it. And of all the phrases in the whole world that they could have picked, instead of "our existence is resistance" or any of these other things, it simply said "be thankful," as though we must be thankful for these accommodations that are done for us. And it's so deeply offensive because we're the ones that are fighting for change, and then people are picking it up and telling us to be thankful. And so the thing that's really important about this sort of new, I don't even call it a disability rights movement, I sort of see it as a disability identity reclamation movement, is that what you have is you have a group of people who are rejecting the status quo, people who are rejecting this idea of sort of what is a norm. And what you're getting out of it is this really sort of brilliant creative thinking. And what I think is the future of sort of the implications of disability aren't necessarily going to be accessibility, but that I think we're going to shift for everybody what identity and what normal is. And I think that's going to be the thing that we sort of our mark on the world. And so I look at a couple of things in ways that our inclusion can shift that, if we're going to use the word inclusion. One of them is that when you sort of forget, I actually in a lot of ways reject compliance standards, and one of the things I'm going to start really advocating and lobbying for is companies that say they're committed to disability, I want to absolve them entirely of compliance standards if they're bringing disabled people in. Because what you have is right now I'm working with a hotel, and I'm creating something called Danger Room. And what Danger Room is we're bringing a bunch of really cool creative disabled people into the room. We're giving them a list of all the compliance standards that the room must comply by, and then we're taking it to the nth degree so that the compliance becomes dangerous. So we're going to have a ramp over the bed and super hilarious, playful things. And for me, this is what happens when you invite disabled people into the picture. And so I have a friend here that I want to call out, and I'm so sorry to do this to you because I do it all the time. But she's done something so brilliant, and literally, like, it shook me when I saw it. And I think it's sort of worth noting because I think it just demonstrates the power of what happens when you just give voice to a disabled person. So Shannon, I was hoping you could explain the anti-stairs club lounge.
Sure. I am an artist and also a designer, and I proposed a project to an inaccessible exhibition space. It's a 7-story building, and there's no ramps or elevators above the ground floor. It's a repurposed historical agricultural building, so there's lots of reasons why it's not accessible, but it means that of the 7 floors of the exhibition, people who can't use stairs can't go above the first floor. So I created this space called Anti-Stairs Club Lounge, which is a enclosed room on the ground floor that has all sorts of different lounge amenities like candy and chilled seltzer and reading materials and seating. And kind of throughout the whole space, there's a lot of details, like I developed the logo and different things like that. But you can only get access to the lounge if you sign in at the front desk saying that you're not going upstairs. So the lounge is exclusively for people staying on the ground floor.
And it's this rejection of norm and what is assumed that I think is so brilliant. And so for me, that's when I think of access. We're sort of treating access as physical, but my experience of access is actually societal. And so that's really the work that I'm trying to address.
Shannon, where can people see or learn more about the project? What's your full name, by the way?
My last name is Finnegan, F-I-N-N-E-G-A-N. The project is at a nonprofit art center called the Mosaic Project, which is in Mosaic, New York.
Can she speak a little louder?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah. My name is Shannon Finnegan, and the project is at a nonprofit arts organization called the Mosaic Project. And I have a website that has more information on it. It's just shannonfinnegan.com.
Great.
And I've been trying to lobby the city so that we can hijack an accessoride so we can have a party bus that goes to Mosaic. So if anybody here knows anybody in the city or wants to hijack the accessoride with me, let me know.
Awesome. So very shortly, we're going to get to hear from all of you and perhaps hear some of the ideas that you guys have. But before we do that, because there's sort of this two-part premise to this panel about digital accessibility and then education, I'm wondering, from each of you, can you tell us where you the best ideas you can think of for education or where you hope education is going? And Neil, I'll start with you since you've been working in this area.
Well, in education, I hope that this conversation, I hope that these principles are built into the curriculum. I think that's the most important thing that we can do, especially as our graduates go out into the workforce. In the digital space, the principles are really easy. Like that low-hanging fruit that we were talking about earlier, just making sure that your contrast is correct. I believe in Illustrator, you can actually toggle. There's some colorblind settings in there that you can toggle back and forth so you can actually see what your design looks like to someone who's colorblind. Also, your structure of your HTML, how that structure is coded in your code is how someone might tab through your website. That was a really interesting experience for me. I was talking with somebody, and they mentioned to me that they don't really like using a mouse when they're navigating a website. They just like to tab through the information. And I'm like, what? Why would you do that? That's weird. But that's just how they navigate through that. So making sure that your code is up to standards on that. And then one really big thing is putting descriptions with your images, right? I will say it is a bit tedious to do that. But it is really worth it. And I don't mean logo of this, but more of explain your logo. Think of it as if you're in a critique. So go through it step by step. So it's a yellow background color with white sans serif type in the front, all in lowercase, and it's a circular background. So getting kind of deeper into the description Because when you think about it with a screen reader, that's what's happening. The reader is telling you what's on the screen. So if you close your eyes and try to visualize that, that's what you need to put in your description. So in the digital realm, those are some really simple ways to include that in. And then for three-dimensional spatial work, just creating that empathy, I think that is key there. And putting yourself in the shoes of your user helps.
The one thing I would just add to that, particularly for students in the room, is that it's also a reason, and I think we've gotten better at this, but a reason to have live text on websites, right? As opposed to having an image with, the screen, the slice of the text that's not live. A screen reader can't read something that isn't live text. So it's something, just a small thing to keep in mind as well. Bo, do you want us to do all this stuff in education and then your team won't have to train the in-house designers, or what do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that.
Do you want to just briefly say that everybody gets, I don't know if you noticed that everybody who gets hired at IBM has to go through the weekend?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so all the designers that get hired at IBM go through an incubator training period, and that's pivoted and iterated.
In design for disability or accessible design, or what are you calling it?
Yeah, so it's changing right now, actually. So it was a 60-day incubator program, kind of like a design camp, it was called. And the first week of that was dedicated to kind of a hackathon that was done for accessibility, basically. The designers broke into groups and they did hackathon-type projects. The projects were submitted by actual teams throughout IBM so that they could get the innovation and ideation out of the incubator projects. And those designers would pick one disability to be an expert in while they worked on this project. And it was a different disability for each of the groups. At the end of the week, they would come together and do playbacks and talk about their products. And this had pivoted quite a bit. I'm sorry, this is, again, I'm kind of going down a trail here, but this had pivoted quite a bit from what we started with, which was like a 2-day projector training for designers, which really scared the crap out of everybody. And they were brand new employees, and we were sort of saying, the first thing you're going to learn is all of this compliance that you have to do. That pivoted into being much more creative. And the interesting thing was that the projects at the end of the week actually were almost completely accessible as we see it for IBM. They were all had great contrast, they had good color, all the images were explained. It was without having to look at all of the disabilities, the whole spectrum of accessibility. They were actually able to get empathy and figure it out and kind of socialize that together. I would say a smaller percentage of designers that come into IBM have experience with accessibility. Most of the experienced designers had a job where they had to do it and are not. Now, I haven't interviewed for a few years, so I'm hoping that it's starting to change a little bit, because I do see the attitude of designers changing currently in IBM. And instead of designers coming to me to ask me how they can blur the lines of accessibility to do their design so that they can not comply, designers are now coming to me to ask me how to give them ammunition to argue better accessibility for their teams, which is a complete split. It's subtle for a lot of people, don't see that, but for me it's huge. When a designer comes to me, I automatically get defensive. Like, hey, I know you don't want to do this. You got to do this, at least get to this 3:1 color contrast ratio. And what I'm realizing now is they're saying, hey, my team wants to do right at 3.1, can you help me argue for better contrast? Can you help me argue because I'm really not comfortable with, not having affordability or affordance on my input boxes that are flat. Now, no one can tell where to put the, can you help me with an accessibility compliance issue? And maybe this is a reason for standards. To come back to my team and say, look, you guys got to take the extra time to change this. This isn't going to work. Right?
What about hiring folks who are disabled and who are designers? Is that a priority for IBM?
I hope so, yeah. I mean, that is, I had a question also for this panel too, but maybe we won't get to it. But a lot of companies, I think we're all very aware that companies are using people with disabilities in their ads, right, on TV, everywhere. I'm skeptical about it as a marketing technique. There was a recent campaign to hire people with ASD with autism. That for me, I felt like they were using. This is my personal opinion. I felt like that community was being used to sell products.
You're right.
Yeah.
And that was going to be a question for.
So what was the question?
Well,
Your question is more interesting.
I can respond to it.
okay, I want to make sure that I finish with the question.
Well, we can get back to
Okay,
that. Go for it.
yeah, flow.
So I think for me, education is, I view it a little bit different. I don't view it as educating you guys, even though clearly you guys get educated in the process. I'm trying to educate two different groups. The first group is I'm trying to educate disabled people. I'm trying to tell disabled people we are creative and we're valuable. So in that realm, I'm in the process of debuting a program called WITH, and I have Google Creative Lab, I have SY Partners, and a few others on board. And starting in the fall, what we're going to do is we're going to partner the top creative disabled talent in the city with the top design studios and creative spaces. And what we're trying to do is sort of break down this pipeline issue and start getting disabled people into design, because what you have is you have disabled people and you have designers, and we're not communicating. And so how is it that, and there's a variety of reasons why disabled people aren't entering design fields. My friend Andrea Levant is a senior strategist for Girl Scouts of America. She dreamt of going to fashion design school, but she couldn't find an accessible program. So she went to school for communications. I didn't become disabled until long after I graduated. So there's a variety of reasons. And so how is it that we can break it down and we can start having people cobble together a design education like I had, so that people do start to see that there's spaces? So if we can get creative disabled people into design spaces, then can I convince Parsons to create what my dream is a sit lab, and eventually can we turn New York City into a hub for disability entrepreneurship? So that's WITH. And then in terms of educating brands, what I'm doing is I've created something called the Disabled List. And it's just creative disabled people who are available to consult. Because what happens is brands decide that they're interested in disability, but they don't know where to turn. And so they tend to turn to charities. But charities are not disabled people, and historically they have silenced disabled people and spoken for us. And so what I'm doing is creating a list of actual disabled people who are absolutely brilliant. Shannon is one of them, and we're around to do the good, creative, immersive work. And so I guess I want to respond a little bit to what you were saying. There is a lot of sort of tokenistic appropriation of disability. So brands, if they want to do a visual representation of disability, they usually go straight to really three people: wheelchair users, amputees, and people with Down syndrome. And it's because they're not threatening and they're highly visible. But the thing is 71% of disabilities are completely invisible. And so how is it that you authentically integrate disability into your brand? Well, what you have to do is understand that disability is a culture, and you have to tap that culture. And so that's really the thing that I'm trying to help facilitate. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
That's great.
Just to continue, the reason I brought up that point is I haven't seen any campaigns to specifically hire people with disabilities as designers. I think that our design group wants to be as diverse as possible. We do hire people with disabilities. In my group, I'm lucky because I think people with disabilities gravitate to the accessibility organization in our team. So I get to work directly with several people who have disabilities, and that for me helps to expand my knowledge in those areas.
It's a pipeline issue. Disabled people aren't entering design fields. And so for me, it's about starting at step one and creating accessible spaces within learning institutions, so that it does occur to you that, oh, there's a talent field here. And so, we're at the very beginning of it. But if we can start it now, maybe 6, 8, 10 years from now, you would know right where to go, and you wouldn't just see it as like sort of tokenistic, like hiring a disabled person, but you would see it as hiring the person who is most appropriate for the position.
Right,
Yeah, that's
absolutely. And what I'm also seeing are projects, especially kind of nonprofit projects, to connect people with disabilities with jobs. And I haven't seen a lot of success in that area. It's like, I feel like it's a good idea, but it hasn't really connected, so.
It's because none of those initiatives are driven by
Right.
disabled people.
The other thing I was going to say, which is another interesting change inside IBM, is when I came into the accessibility group about 4 years ago, talking about people with disabilities on the job, there's a lot of ethical issues with that. People that don't want to self-identify as that having disabilities on the job, asking people to do usability testing at IBM inside of the company and asking for people with disabilities to come forward was very difficult because of this self-identification issue of, especially invisible disabilities. Well, recently a group has organized, it's led by a man in my group who is blind, Eric Manser, and he has got Team Able together, which is a group, I think that it's about 40 strong now, of people who have self-identified to come forward and help with usability testing, help socialize disabilities inside the company. So that's another, I don't know if you could say that that's a positive outcome of the marketing that's happening. There's like some like socialization, positive vibe going out from that, even though.
Well, that's why
Right.
you will benefit from the work of disability advocates, because in sort of a brief disability history, and am I talking too much?
That's okay, go for it.
Okay, so brief.
We're going to open it up after you talk. Again, we're going to open it up to the audience.
That's what we're here for.
So brief disability history. So disability did not exist before industrialization. You had a blind person, you had a person with cerebral palsy, and you had a person with drop foot living in their communities, sort of, contributing as they can, getting by. They were not equated to each other. They were not seen as disabled or as of a thing. So industrialization rolled around and it created this expectation that bodies could perform in rote and mechanized tasks. And so what happened is that process created a subset of bodies that could not contribute as others could. Industry needed a means to identify these bodies, and so they turned to doctors and philosophers at the time to identify these bodies as disabled. They were diagnosed. So this is the medical model of disability. We are disabled by our bodies. But the interesting thing is we live in this post-industrialized era. So I'll go back to that. So those bodies were then segregated and institutionalized and thus needed sort of charity and as a means for survival. But we live in this post-industrialized era. 11% of our college population is disabled. We're an emerging $8 trillion market the size of China. And we ascribe to the social model of disability, which states we are not disabled by our bodies, we're disabled by the world around us. And one of the biggest ways that the social model has really taken off is really through social media. And so what you have is in the way that, and I actually see this a lot in Blackness. So in the way that Blackness was created by colonialism and industry and labor, that is the same way that disability was created by industrialization and industry and labor, right? And so, I think once disabled people start to realize that this is a construct and we are, because of social media, finally able to stop seeing ourselves as a diagnosis, but instead a community with a culture. And as we increasingly grow that culture, which is the work of advocates, you're not going to have an issue with sort of identification because, and this is why I say disabled people and you say people with disabilities, is because you believe that's person first. And I was until about February of last year when Trump got elected. And that's because what I realized is that I'm identity first. For the first time in history, disability is a voting bloc. It's hugely powerful. That's the social model of disability. We realize that together we are much more powerful. And so I am a disabled person. I put disability first because I believe I am one of a community. And so as we grow this community and as we see ourselves as part of something greater, and as we grow sort of political power and cultural capital within that, we're not going to not want to identify as such because, it's going to be a highly powerful, important thing to be. Sorry.
How are you making it so hard for anybody to describe the community?
No,
I'm
it's
saying, like,
about identity. So it's
Right.
it's about how does an individual identify.
and I mean, the reason that I say that
Yeah.
is that I've been conditioned to say that.
Well, and you would have
It's not-
no
it's not-
reason to, because we're always breaking and building. You know,
Right.
we're pushing forward.
And I think it's very interesting because that's one of the qualitative points of designers working with people with disabilities is exactly what you're talking about, whether it's the disability or the person, and how to talk about it, how to be
And
around it, you know. And I think that what you're describing as, I think those are interesting points with how do you use it in the language, and how, like, for as a teacher to
Yeah.
designers.
And that's what's so
now
powerful.
now I'm going to consider.
But that's what's so powerful about
Yeah.
culture is I personally don't even know yet if you have the right yet to say disabled people, right? Like that's our term,
Right.
you know? And like we're like the fact that we have an our term, we would only know that if there was other cultures that were based on constructs, right? So, you know, there's this way in which we're so forward thinking and we're finally coming together, and it makes it hard to be on the outside. It does, you know, it's increasingly going to. And we do that, we create that pressure on you because we think we should have voice, right? Doesn't mean that you don't belong, that you shouldn't be doing the work. But like, I sort of see disabled people as being in our rebellious teenage years, right? Like we're finally saying, no, like we got it, you know? And so then what happens is, especially with caretakers and everybody who's always cared and nourished us, they're saying, well, you know, how do I fit into this? And it's really difficult. And I just think it's brilliant, and I love it. Like I love that you can find yourself uncomfortable at times. I love that the light bulb goes off for you. I love that I'm ahead of you, you know? Like I love all of those things because it shows that we got something, you know?
Yeah. Elizabeth, do you want to say something?
Well, I think rather than my saying what it is that that I want to see students do, I want to pick up on this conversation for a moment. So, like I just said earlier, what I see happening is that we have a very kind of lively and dynamic discourse that's going on right now amongst the disability community, and then we also have something going on within design, but there's not a lot of overlap, and so just having you guys sitting here on this panel is hugely helpful for me because I keep bouncing between these worlds and they're not intersecting.
Yeah.
So rather than actually do my little shtick about what I believe, I want to move on to a telephone conversation that Eris and I had like yesterday or 2 days ago, because I said to Eris, you know, this is what's happening and I'm not sure how to get it going. And Eris, I said that Liz really strongly believes that disabled people should be designers. So where does that leave designers then who are not disabled? And you actually had an answer to that, which I had not necessarily come up with. So I don't.
Refresh my memory.
You were saying that you thought that not necessarily DIY, that is the way to go if you're talking about bringing disabled people into a design situation without design training.
So I mean, I remember the conversation. I'm not sure I remember exactly my response. I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me, I think Elizabeth was saying, like, we have these people on this panel who like have really different, are coming from really different places, and I was like, I know, isn't it awesome? Like, to me, that's what makes a good panel, right? When everybody's like agrees, you're like, oh, like, why did we need 4 of you up there, right? So to me, like, what's really exciting here, and this is why, like, I feel like I'm in a privileged position to be able to moderate a panel like this, is I learned so much from different perspectives. But I also had the perspective of like, oh, it's really interesting to hear different people sort of take on the issue in a different way. I grew up in this place where my parents were back to landers, and like we were making our own tofu and like making and growing all our vegetables, and you know, my rebellion was like, oh my God, we don't have to make all of our own stuff, right? And so, you know, I think that this is a really interesting time and what way of thinking about different things. I'm not necessarily equating that with the disability community, except that there's going to be different perspectives, and it's a perfect time for me to segue into this quote that I wrote down. Almost every product I can think of that is meant to solve a disability-related challenge is designed/sold by a disabled person or their immediate relative. That may seem logical/positive, but it also means large companies and most qualified, talented, established designers or innovators aren't really looking at the area at all. And so that was, I think that I had like a very personal reaction, but it was sort of informed by this quote that comes from my student over here, Stephen Verdilli, and it sort of like reminds, and he, like I was saying, like which products are doing it well, and this was sort of, he gave me a list, and then this came out, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting to think that maybe, we have on one hand Liz who's saying that, we need not just to have disabled people as, the people for whom products are made for, but they need to be involved. And then we have somebody else who's saying, yeah, but when they're like involved, like you have economies of scale that might be missing. So I think it's really what Elizabeth is saying, that we need to, join the worlds of like the giant corporation that has hundreds of thousands of employees with like this really innovative advocacy thinking of an organization like Liz has. Otherwise, we just end up with sort of more niche markets. And at that, I am opening it up to all of you. Stephen, do you want to say anything about your quote, since I didn't tell you I was quoting you? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I would say, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of products that are made by disabled people for disabled people, and it's a good place to start, but I do think a lot of times the quality isn't there that we get on the commercial side, because there's such a low budget, there's no research, it's being made, in someone's garage.
Yeah.
And a lot of the stuff I use and that helps me get through my daily life is from these people that I bought at these weird conventions, and I appreciate it, but I think there's definitely room for those products to be from Target or Walmart or produced by Apple and that kind of thing. It's just not there right now.
Does somebody else in the audience have a question for the panelists or a comment? Yep.
Yes. I teach in a graduate exhibition and experiences program, so I'm very curious about Shannon's project. But I'm wondering if any of you might speak to like developing and designing interactive wayfinding systems and kiosks. We did a project last semester for the Manhattanville Columbia University campus that would integrate NYCHA housing with the Manhattanville Columbia University campus and Columbia University. And I made my students think about every aspect of accessibility, from language to vision to hearing to cognitive to physical. The other caveat is teaching students, where 90% of the students are international students. So they have no sense of what it is like to be disabled here in this country or in their own country.
Interesting. So you were talking, when you started the question specifically about experience design?
Interactive,
yeah.
finding kiosks,
Yeah.
which you can go up to the kiosk and identify like information, find mapping. So is there like sound that could describe like what you should be doing? If you're a person that is visually impaired, if you're hearing impaired, how do you write the content in language so that it's really descriptive? All of those things to teach graduate students. Because we do pop-ups, we do interpretive exhibitions, we do wayfinding, we do trade shows, and it's a big thing in our department now to get the students to understand that when they go out into the field, these are some of the areas that they need to address besides color lines too.
Yeah, that's a great example. And for those of you who are maybe not totally imagining what those might look like for instance, imagine going up to the link, I don't know what you call the platforms all over the city, and like how do you interact with that if you are not, even if you're mobility impaired, so maybe you can't even see it from that angle, if you're blind, if you have hearing impairment. So any ideas from
That's a lot. I would say, especially for graduate students, I would definitely make them do exercises that put them in the shoes of their users. So if there are users that might be vision impaired, like create that vision impairment and let them experience the world through that. And I guarantee they will understand very quickly the world and the needs of that particular user.
We did a few exercises similar to what you were talking about. We wanted to figure out how we could go into the NYCHA house. We didn't have a lot of time and actually work with some of the residents there. So 70% of the residents in the NYCHA housing on 125th Street were seniors.
So I went, I was at South by this year, and there's an organization in Austin called Knowbility.
What is it called?
Knowbility, Knowbility. And so they do a lot of sort of digital access. And so they had set up this booth. And one half of the booth was an information booth, but the other half was a couch with a TV screen and a blind man on his computer. And what would happen is people who were at South by that had that were sort of curious about accessibility, they could sit down and they could give the blind man their website, and then the man would navigate through their website on a screen reader as they watched on the screen as he did it. So they would sort of see what would happen on the screen reader. And so I sat there with this guy. His website was, I can't remember what his website was, but he came in and he was first really scared because he thought that his website was going to be highly inaccessible. And the guy goes through it, and the guy ends up feeling really relieved because it ends up being fairly accessible, and he saw the fixes for himself. And so he said, I'm going to immediately call my team and we're going to fix this because I know exactly what to do. So after he was feeling really excited, I said to him, well, this is just sort of one aspect of it. Like the next thing is there's sort of these color blindness tests that you want to do, and you can just find them online. And he said, well, can I be really honest with you? And I said, yeah. He said, I'm not going to do it. And I said, why? And he said, because I didn't experience it with somebody. And so while you advocate for kind of putting a blindfold on somebody and putting somebody in that position, I can't imagine blindfolding anybody in this room and asking them to use a screen reader and then having an accurate depiction of that experience, because a screen reader is something that you learn over time. And so instead of really, so the disability.
I agree with you. The screen readers read really fast.
They do, but this is the thing about disabilities. People think that they can just sort of stick somebody in a wheelchair or blindfold them or do whatever, and then suddenly that person's going to have that experience. But the person is an absolute novice. We are experts in our experience. And so the thing that I learned from it is instead of really trying to kind of put somebody in somebody else's shoes, let somebody experience it with somebody who's an expert. If you want to sort of focus on blindness, there's a ton of blind schools in the city. You can find the right person. And what happens is, I think, it actually ends up being a much more powerful experience because they then understand sort of the brilliance and the expertise of the person that's doing the thing, and they understand sort of where they are in this situation, and they can come up with a much better answer than trying to do something that they have no idea how it works.
We have a few students that are I teach at FYT, so
Yeah.
there are some students that are visually impaired and hearing impaired.
Yeah.
Because it's a state school, they cannot say you can't attend school.
Yeah.
So it's kind of tricky putting out a call and asking those students to participate because of the state guidelines.
Call me, I'll help.
Yeah, it seems to me that, not all disabilities are permanent, right? But it seems to be the permanence of particular disabilities that change the outlook, as opposed to these empathy exercises of temporarily, constrain or restrain your left arm and work all day. Well, yes, that's hard, and that'll give you a view, but there's a whole different perspective from that's going to be like that.
And that's what I was going to say to that point is when we do those exercises, I tell them exactly that. This is a very big concern. You're not living the rest of your life with this disability or impairment as the user that you're designing for. So take that into account and recognize that. That at the end of this exercise, you go back to your able life.
Yeah.
Whereas someone who is disabled can't go back to their able life.
Nor would they want to.
So it is definitely a concern that I point out to them and that they do understand, but it's a really good point to go through it with someone who has that impairment.
I assure you, it's Super
I'm
awesome.
actually going to bring that into my class.
Do it. I promise. You'll love it.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Mush. I'm a faculty member at SUNY Oswego, so I'm from a rural area.
Upstate.
Area. And, you know, I used to do some exercises like that until I had students respond saying, man, it really sucks to do what, like, to age or to have a disability or whatever. And as soon as that happened a few times, it's like, I'm never doing this again. Because it just wasn't the perspective that I wanted students to have and what I was going for. My struggle of involving people with disabilities is that my access is much more limited in a rural area that's really not very accessible in the first place. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for, I've been really wanting to do some of the things that you're describing, but I'm not sure how to do it when there's such a distance issue.
Yeah, I actually was thinking about this myself too, because a lot of it is access. And I am sort of wondering if, it's weird because I have been thinking about this, in terms of just specifically my experience at South by with the screen reader, is there a way that we can set up a video, right? And then just like, because there are people who want to do this, right? Like they see that their work in sort of teaching accessibility through their experience is deeply valuable. You know, I know a few in Austin and South by and Portland. And so, you know, I think that's the brilliance of technology these days is we can find access. It's just, you don't know where to turn. And so that's why we need to start creating these kind of communities and pipelines and webs so that you can find the right person and you don't feel like you're sort of tokenizing them or anything by approaching them, but rather that you're valuing their expertise.
Yeah,
So-
maybe,
Go ahead.
just not only, I was actually thinking the exact same thing was the ability to look at maybe a library of videos to find, but then I thought, you know, there's also remote communication, live communication, that could be very useful too. You know, if you, let's say you were doing a wayfinding exercise and you wanted to know what it was like, perhaps you could connect with someone with a disability and have a live session with them over some sort of live media. I don't know. I mean, that seems like a stretch, but maybe in another year it's easy.
What if like IBM like sponsored and created a program of videos that people could watch?
Okay, just a second.
Good campaign.
In the back first.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, panel, very much. I'd like to introduce all of you. I teach here at General Assembly. I also teach at NYU. I am an advocate for people with disabilities because I strongly believe in it, and I teach it in my class. I'm probably one of the few UX designers that does teach it and incorporate it. So for the person who is more a comment, for the person who's talking, and just to share with everyone, what I did in my class was I had my students create an empathy map for a person who was low vision, blind, or colorblind, their choice. And then I have them, over the course of a few weeks, create a product for somebody, a chef who could cook based off the MasterChef person who won a few years ago who was blind. And then they came up with these ideas, and then I brought two blind people actually in the classroom to critique their product. So for the person who was asking what they could do, is I would start with an empathy map, have people come with all their assumptions, and then because you are remote or far away, you can definitely get people on a Zoom and have them answer the questions. Because right now you're in a room full of people who know a lot of people, and I would say connect with those people, because I want to connect with all of you, and get people involved and get people with disabilities to come into the classroom or to get them to be remote. So that was just more of a comment and a big thank you to the panel. I'm very happy that you're here. This fills my heart with joy because this is a lot of people and very proud of a lot of people.
Well, in the workshop, we're actually going to do an empathy map just like that. So.
I'm also at FIT, and I'm interested on your perspectives because all of you have been dealing with advocacy in different ways. And so when I came to the university, the institution, I originally went in with the idea that it's a product issue. We're not delivering content to that we can develop better design for a broader audience. What I've come to understand that it is a content content issue, but we can't even deliver good content to our own students. Like the content is not accessible in its design, so we can't even reach to our own neurodivergent students.
Yeah.
And in trying to raise that issue with my colleagues who come from a long heritage of success with technical execution, I'm just wondering, in your own work communities, how you deal with like that wall.
Your question makes me feel so tired.
I mean, I know it's like huge, right? But that was like the big aha moment. It's like, how can we talk about there's a problem when some people just don't even recognize that it's a problem?
That's the work of advocates,
Yeah.
right? That's why you need us, is because we say it. I think, that's the battle right now. And I don't have the best answer other than, to show up each day and sort of continue pushing for more. I work a lot with AARP. I have sort of, like Seth Godin always says, like you need to find the outlier within a company and then cling for dear life. So it's this woman, Karen Chong, she does social innovation. And she just goes into AARP and she preaches like Liz, because AARP is aging, but she wants them to be disability. And for the longest time, she wasn't getting anywhere. And then I was invited to do this National Academy of Sciences event. And all the people that she was preaching internally to about me, they saw me speak. And then as soon as they saw me speak, they went to Karen and they said, who's this person? Liz, she's amazing, right? She knows her shit, disability, wow, it's super, we can do this. And Karen's like, I know, I've been talking for years about Liz. And the thing is it's not me. It's really any disabled person that can speak to their experience. And so for me, what it's about is what can you facilitate and get people to show up for that starts to elevate these disabled voices, because every single time, right, people are gonna be blown away by how brilliant, our work is. And it's not just Shannon, there's Shannon Garfield is an industrial design student at Pratt who has Lyme disease, and she had to drop out of school for a while, but she went back. And the first thing that she created was a kitchen system that would allow her to lift and pour heavy objects, because she needs to cook a very specific food, but oftentimes is very weak. The next thing that she made was a cane that ended up making it into Cooper Hewitt. Right? She's super brilliant. And then there's Jerron Herman, who's the first principal of dance for a physically integrated dance group. He has cerebral palsy, can only use one arm. When he goes to the local diner, he orders a waffle and he gets a pizza cutter on the side. It's brilliant, right? It's infectious, the work that we do. The thing is these solutions and these things that we come up with, they're not stories of survival. We're literally bragging on and delighting in our ingenuity. And so it's if you can get our infectious spirit and our creativity in front of these people, it becomes obvious.
I would just like to interrupt for a second and say that I think that's very much your sort of perspective. And I love how hopeful it is. I would love to hear from Elizabeth, who's been in academia, and I've known her for years, and sort of coming up against, all of us who are educators in this room, we know that the only thing that moves faster than government, right, is higher ed. So, that's just the reality of our lives. And so Elizabeth has been sort of in the trenches for years.
Yeah.
And I think her perspective is quite different. And so I just want to give voice to that a little bit.
Right, so that's one of the things I love about Liz, is that she's so positive that I can turn to Liz whenever I get really upset or depressed. Because my experience, quite honestly, as a disabled person in an academic setting, is that it's really hard to make people listen. And I think there's a big fear factor out there. And my campus is being sued right now in 2 different ways, 2 different class action suits. One of them is for the physical environment, which is all the problems that I've had. And the stories I've been telling Liz, I've seen the disabled parking has been turned into loading zones. I was charged for 2 years to pay for my own disabled parking place. All the disabled parking 3 years ago in my area was turned into a bike rack. So, when you've got a kind of hostile college administration, and I think in our case there is some hostility, there's that on the one side. And John is nodding because my student up here in the front has been advocating for disabled students. And do you want to tell everybody just briefly what happened with our Disabled Student Body Group Association was put in an office?
Yeah, they were put in an office that isn't
accessible.
Yeah, and the campus would not move them to another space. Well, anyhow, it just goes on and on. So on that level, we're being sued right now. We also have a class action suit about our web access as well. So I was put, because I've always been complaining about this, but we're at a point where it's very hard for disabled students even to enter the campus, so there are almost no disabled students. They decide they have to leave. So I've been pretty alone and pretty lonely in this, so I got thrown onto the committee about the web access stuff. And I went into that first meeting, and it was a coterie of fear.
Yeah.
Like, there was such a strong sense that, oh my God, we can't tell anybody that we've got this problem, because if we do, we're going to give fodder to the opposite side. So we got to hush up, and we got to work really fast. And the whole thing was, this is my sense, we've got to figure out ways to get around the rules, not like we're really going to address them. So for me, a big problem is in all of this that I think there is a larger culture of fear out there, and I think Bo was speaking to that earlier about the kind of punitive way that within IBM designers at first greeted your work, that they felt like they were being constrained and they were a little bit kind of angry. So I love the way that Liz talks, because Liz is so kind of open to this idea of a new creativity coming from those restraints. But that's a huge cultural mindset, and unfortunately what's happening at the moment is that you get this sense of the law and guidelines, and we're doing this because we have to. Whereas what should be done, if we can do it right, is more what you're talking about.
Well, we can't sue you if we're in the room, right?
What do you mean?
Like, we can't sue.
Oh yeah, right.
Sue a school.
Well,
if we're part of the process. Like,
yeah.
Are we going to sue you for what we did?
Well, also, so
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I asked to be removed from that one committee, and my name is still on the committee. So, you know, why is that happening?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyhow, so I love the way that you frame this in such a positive way.
Yeah, but it is frustrating.
At a certain
Yeah.
point, Elizabeth, would you think that asking for forgiveness later is better than asking for permission on certain things?
Like asking for forgiveness for.
Well, say like a wayfinding signage system that could be in a building for those that can't take stairs. That
Yeah.
it may not be existing at the moment. So asking for forgiveness after you've done the project and it just appears one day.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out what my own role could be within this. I've been teaching a class called Investigating Normal next semester, and I was hoping to kind of do some interventions like that. But the little bits of things I've done have not led me to, like I tried to get our community design class to remake the disabled logo, and I was told no, the students want portfolio pieces. They don't want to do stuff like that, advocacy stuff. So it's weird. But anyhow, yeah, I agree. Maybe that's the tack to take.
Just
We could-
do it.
We have
Just do it, yes.
We have one question over here, and then we're going to have to wrap up pretty shortly because of time, and you can come up and sort of continue these conversations among yourselves.
Yeah, thank you. I just have a question for Elizabeth. You mentioned early on about the Universal Accessibility Icon and symbol, and I'm really curious to get your thoughts about that. I mean, from you and also the panel, and just like what you think about the symbol, especially its like latest.
Yeah, the latest iteration,
Yeah.
right? So that symbol, of course, has been some kind of static and rigid. It's everywhere, but it actually seems awfully disabling when disabled people and their advocates look at it. So it's been changed in recent years and is now state law in New York to have this kind of figure that looks dynamic and is pushing itself forward. So I got involved in that book. The real story why I started writing a book about its history was that at my campus, where I've just told you there were all these problems, that new symbol of the really politically correct, dynamically active guy was being put up everywhere, just at the point that they were taking away a lot of the real access. So it was super frustrating to me, and I ended up with a grudge against that symbol because I felt like it was blue washing, is what I was calling it. You know, so they were trying to get away with things, but hiding it by putting the symbol up. So I ended with very conflicted feelings about that. I did then write the book. I interviewed all these people who were involved in it, and I recognized solely their really whole commitment that they're making and trying to make that statement. But I am very wary, and I feel like I've been burned by doing these kinds of papering over a really serious issue. So that symbol, you know, it's nice, but is it bringing more disabled people into the design process? Is it doing the work of the stuff that we're talking about in here? I'm not always sure.
I've never thought about it that way. How do you feel about describing, instead of describing the user on the signage, describing the space?
Oh, okay, so do you want to explain to people what that would be? Because that's interesting. Yeah.
Well,
Go, no.
Oh,
please,
so
go ahead.
right now signage describes the user, so it then stigmatizes the accessibility. So if you're not in a wheelchair, then you don't feel like you have access to it. But if you're going to describe the space, if it's a ramp, you would just have a sign of a ramp. If it was an elevator, you have a sign of an elevator. And that way it kind of gets away from that sort of segregation and stuff.
I'd be interested, I guess we just don't have enough time, I'd be interested in hearing other people's opinions about this. My sense is, with that blue and white symbol, is that it's one of the most recognized symbols throughout the world at this point. So any kind of change of it then undercuts the work that had been done with that. And I think we all better really be clear amongst ourselves right here that disability, as we think of it, and this whole system of laws and everything we're talking about is very much a Western construct, and it's really rated mainly within civil rights law. This is civil rights that we're talking about, and that's something that in the U.S. I do think we should give ourselves some credit for, that we do that. We believe in that. Because I have traveled all over the world, and I can tell you, you see those signs up a lot elsewhere, but they don't give you access very often. So I do want to say that it has a kind of power. If that sign is in places like, I've just been writing on Japan, because I went there as a disabled person in 1990, and they had no elevators to trains. Like, the station master would have to carry you on his back down to the platform. There was no culture of disability knowledge there, and even to this day there are problems there that we don't have here. So that symbol does work here, and it's starting to do work elsewhere. So I'm a little worried about losing the symbol just because it has so much importance at this point.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we're actually going to have to wrap it up there. I know I saw a bunch of hands, so you have tons more questions, and obviously the panel and all of us could go on talking for the next couple hours, but we do have to set up for the workshop. Those of you, how many of you are staying on for the workshop? Oh, wow. Okay, so we are continuing the conversation, almost all of us anyway, so that's fantastic. Please feel free to come up and connect with the panelists, connect with each other. It's great to see so many people in this room interested in the same thing, and I think that's going to be my last word. Stacey, is there any housekeeping stuff?
Hi, sorry, hi.
Do we need housekeeping?
How many people are staying?
They're almost everybody.
Because we actually don't have everybody registered for the workshop, so we have to figure out how that's going to work out.
Oh, okay, so do you want people?
Yeah, just come and see me. If you didn't actually pay and register for the workshop, you need to come see me.
Yeah. On the honor system allows us to make make more events like this. So can we give a huge round of applause? Thanks for being such a fantastic audience. We hope to see you at more AIGA and Design Incubation events, and many of you we will see back in just over an hour.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.